Hello, I'm Susan Raff, and welcome to Real Talk. Today's topic is a bit sobering. It is about hate speech, something that we are seeing, unfortunately, in many of our communities in Connecticut and also throughout the country. Most recently, a state representative in our state called the governor or compared the governor to Hitler. A state representative also in Chicago did the same thing. And it's happening locally. In Guilford, for example, some Republicans running for school board on a website, they had a picture of Hitler and used a quote that was taken down eventually, but I think it left a very disturbing image for a lot of people. And we wanted to bring someone on to Real Talk to have a frank discussion about what we're seeing and what kind of impact that's having, and is it here to stay? And so we are joined now by Sujata Gadkar Wilcox, who's an associate professor of legal studies at Quinnipiac University. She focuses on constitutional law, human rights. And so thank you for joining us on Real Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan.
All right. Wow. I mean, did you ever think in our world or our society that people would quote Hitler as a way to describe anybody?
No, yeah. And the first point, I think, whenever you make a reference to Hitler is you have to think about whether the kind of insensitivity to compare context here and really thinking about the tragedy of the Holocaust and the actual suffering of people. But also, I think, people, I say it, as a kind of hyperbole when they're speaking about a context that they're frustrated about. But, I just think it generally doesn't also take conversation very far, because that kind of hyperbole, it may help for something like Facebook where you're, increasing the number of views on the post then, or people start coming to it because it's this kind of inflammatory, sensationalized rhetoric. But, in ordinary conversations, it doesn't take the conversation anywhere, because where do you go from there, right? So I actually think it's being used for a purpose to kind of instigate, but I don't really think it helps move the debate forward, where there's a genuine debate.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you could say moving the debate forward, but it moves things forward. So in the example with Representative Dauphin here in Connecticut, who made the comment and compared Lamont to Hitler, she could have said, he's a dictator, but by using the word Hitler, I think that some feel that is done on purpose, maybe to ignite that kind of anger. So it may not maybe be a creative debate, but it does further the conversation, and it creates a lot of maybe backlash and disturbing.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think what people, when they're talking about a governor or a president as being dictatorial in this climate, what it usually means is a conversation about mandates and whether those are excessive and excessively restrictive. So again, if you wanted to actually talk about the debate, I think we were not doing enough to go back to like the constitutional context, right? I don't think the problem is being skeptical of the government. I mean, we have constitutional criminal procedural protections because we were concerned, the framers were concerned with governmental overreach, right? That's always a question. The problem is when people speak about these things, they talk about rights in the Constitution as if they're absolute, as if they've never been balanced with what is necessary for the public good. And the reality is that has always been the case. So it's always been a discussion of when can a right be limited, right? So yes, is wearing a mask a slight deprivation of liberty? There have been deprivations of liberty. There have been limits to free speech, but it's in balance, right? When it becomes a threat, when it becomes intimidation, when it's inciting violence, becomes more like an act. Now that's a harm to society, so speech can be limited. So these rights have never been absolute. And the problem is when people talk about masks, they say, "Oh, well, it's my right not to wear one," And I hear a lot of this language about choice, but you don't have a choice, for example, not to stop at a stop sign, right? You can't say, well, everybody, I decide to choose and everybody has a choice not to do it. We kind of balance when a mandate is necessary, right, with what is necessary kind of for public safety overall, right? And in the context of the pandemic, that might change as science changes, right? So that's why the mandates may be temporary, because it's not necessary depending on what the science says. But that's a very nuanced and complicated debate that we're not even having when people are saying these are excessively restrictive mandates. Why? Let's talk about that.
Right. And thank you for bringing that up, because I probably should have been more clear. I mean, that was the I guess the context for the dictatorship, right? That the mandates, but the very reality is lawmakers voted on that. So it wasn't simply a governor saying, this is what I want to do. Now, granted, Democrats have the majority in Connecticut, and they voted for that. So there was a process there. But I think, however, you see it when you use hate speech, it really creates a bigger issue, if you will, than what we're talking about. And for people to do that. Now, you teach, you have students. How do they feel about that? I mean, we're seeing more, almost like diplomacy or civility disappear. And politics seems to be the thing that's drawing everybody apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're still coming out of the pandemic at a time when we're really isolated from one another. And I think that means that incidents of we're seeing more hate speech, we're seeing more anxiety, everything is on the rise, because it's much easier to create the other, right? To think of people as threats or think of issues as threatening, because you're not in community together. And I think that makes sense that it's on the rise. We're now finally on campus coming out of that. So that's a nice thing that we're able to start being together on campus. But, what I've on campus, at least what I've noticed, and yesterday there was just a bipartisan debate from the college Republicans and the college Democrats. And I have to say, I was very impressed by both groups, because it didn't break down into, hyperbole. It actually, in fact, what they were doing was focusing on the party platform. So what I heard was I actually heard more agreement than I did disagreement, which I thought was interesting when it comes to students having these conversations. So, for example, they didn't disagree on a minimum wage. They disagreed on a federal minimum wage. So they went back to principles of federalism to say, well, the minimum wage should be handled as a state by state issue and not as a federal issue. They both agreed in terms of violence when they had a conversation about the insurrection that, they just don't condone violence. And so it was interesting to me to see that there was, as the students, and maybe it's because we're on an academic campus, but this is what the party should be doing, right? They're having debates that actually have a philosophy that's rooted in the party platform. And I saw that for the first time on campus. And it was very civil, and perhaps because we were all together on campus having the conversation. It wasn't on social media. It wasn't on Facebook. And we have had instances where you have those things on, the kind of TikTok sites that have, where things really get out of hand. But when they were together in person having this debate, it was a real debate. I have to say, I was really impressed with them, and that was just yesterday.
And you've opened the window for another debate, and that is social media. I mean, that
Yes.
plays a huge role, I think, in what we're seeing here, because a lot of information is out there, a lot of disinformation, and
Yes.
people are able to say things maybe that they wouldn't say to someone. How destructive is social media, especially when it comes to hate speech?
I think it's a huge problem. I think social media is huge. I mean, I really believe in relationships that are rooted in community. And to me, that's what democracy is really about. It's about participatory engagement, but that really requires engagement, face-to-face interactions in the community. People say things on social media. I mean, I think everybody knows somebody who they're shocked when they meet them in person, can't believe the things that they've been saying on social media, and they're a completely different person when you meet them face to face, right? And have a conversation. And people just don't say the things that they're willing to say on social media. And there's also an incentive for social media. And, now we're seeing controversy over Facebook and what people knew or didn't know, but there's an incentive for that kind of inflammatory speech, because frankly, it attracts people, right? It's sensational. So that's what people are going to click on. That's going to change the algorithm, and that's going to increase the number of people that view that. And so social media in a way feeds into this problem, whereas you can cut it off if there are more opportunities for actual community dialogue.
Right. And I don't know if, Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook can really filter out all the things that are going on, with misinformation. I know members of Congress want to hold them more accountable, especially for what we're seeing on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. But do you think people maybe have to go back and kind of reevaluate themselves on what they're saying? Do you think it's going to become more of a movement that way?
I absolutely agree with you. So I have been saying, I don't think we do good enough job, particularly now after the pandemic, of being around people with whom we disagree. And that's a huge problem for me because debate is the heart of our constitutional framework. The framers, for example, had very, very serious ideological differences and disagreements. And yet they were able to write the Constitution and come up with some compromise. We have to be able to, right now, what we do is, oh, you don't agree with me anymore. I'm going to unfriend you. I don't have to talk to you anymore. I'm going to create my circle, which it becomes an echo chamber. We had talked earlier and mentioned that, groups like the Rotary, across in Connecticut and throughout the country, you have people there who have very different political views that come together for service to the community. That's a very different dynamic, because you also hear from people you don't always agree with. It starts changing your own opinion. It starts changing other people's opinions when they hear from you. And I just think we're getting much better at not doing those things anymore, at kind of isolating ourselves and finding people we agree with, and then just creating circles around those people. And I just think that's so divisive for us, sort of culturally, that we need to find a way to be in those spaces. Right. To be in spaces where, yes, of course, we want to be with people we agree with, because sometimes you really, there is a very serious disagreement. It's hard to kind of navigate that all the time. But you should ask yourself, am I spending any time with someone who has a completely different view? Because I think what's happening too often is people feel they're just dismissed and judged. And I think, and sometimes you can have a fundamental disagreement, but there's a difference between respecting that there should be a way to have a conversation and then say, but I disagree, and here's why I think this position is better or not, or standing in and saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about. That must be right. And judging and dismissing is different than actually disagreeing. And I don't think we're there anymore.
I think also what's divisive is blame. People are always trying to blame everybody. And I'm sure you've heard this, a lot of people blame President Trump in the past 4 years for giving people a voice. But I'm not sure it's that simple. I mean, I think that if maybe these people felt dismissed, and so that may have empowered them to some degree, but I think it existed before then.
Exactly. Right. There are, and people take out their frustration and their anxiety. And this is the problem with social media. It gives them a way, right, to target whatever the frustration is and whatever the sensationalized inflammatory target is. And that's the problem with social media. It's that people have frustrations for a variety of reasons that are systemic, right? That have been happening for years. And now because of the pandemic, because of being isolated, because anxieties are high, that's now being channeled. And it's easily able to be channeled, right, by clever people, or people who are clever and able to sort of, use a kind of narrative that draws people with that kind of inflammatory speech. And that, I think, is the problem, and I think if you start where, understanding that people come to their own perspectives because they have a different lived experience, right? What is that lived experience? Why do they have that perspective? That becomes a very different conversation. And you can actually then start to get to the disagreement, right? People will let their guard down a little bit. I've had these conversations. I know that, people will let their guard down a little bit and they'll start engaging. I really think that that's the way to our political and our social future, is that we have to find a way to really engage with one another. And we're not doing it right now.
Right. We have to agree to disagree, but that seems easier said than done.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, sometimes there is going to be a disagreement, right? I mean, so if you go back to the original heart of the political parties, right, there are sometimes fundamental disagreements on what you think the role of government is, right? How involved you think the federal government should be versus the state government, role of taxes and public services. So there are disagreements, and it's not that there has to be consensus on everything. But there has to be a way forward. There has to be a way to kind of account for these different experiences and create some kind of compromise. right? Which again, a constitution is an example of two very different ideologies finding a compromise with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? You're finding a kind of compromise there in the Constitution.
Do you think as we emerge out of the pandemic that some of this hate speech will dissipate, or do you think it's here for a while?
Well, the students give me hope, I can tell you that. So I see them on campus, and when they're together in community, and I've also seen the mock trial team, for the first time they've been able to come together. It's a different dynamic. So that gives me hope. I'm just worried that we're still coming out of the pandemic, so we're still fairly isolated. We're not back to really engaging. And people also are so busy that they don't have time to do things. I'm a big believer in community forums. Come out to the public, come out to the public library, but people don't have time for that. So I really think that we have to be very intentional if we want to change this dynamic, which has gone off the rails a bit, right? And it's creating anxiety, it's creating frustration. And we need to figure out how we can ourselves sort of intentionally take that step where we're coming together to interact more and build relationships. That's, in community and starting with your local community.
Do your students tell you that they're disturbed by what they're hearing and seeing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They're, and so we've also, I think it leads to sometimes acts of, hate crimes, acts of violence, right? We've seen that nationally. And so that when that frustration turns into violence, you always have to worry. You have to worry there anyway. And you have to worry, I think, about hate speech, right? As a constitutional scholar, I put two hats on with it because it's protected speech under the Constitution. Hate speech, hate crimes are not protected. In other words, if you've committed a hate crime, there can be an elevated penalty because that doesn't infringe on the protections of the First Amendment. But that's still an ongoing debate because people then talk about the First Amendment as if it's absolute, but obscenity is not protected. Fighting words are not protected. There are other categories of speech that are carved out, right? Anything that looks like an act, so intimidation, threats, violence, that is all kind of carved out. But I think we need to go back and sort of ask, why is hate speech protected under the Constitution? So we want to make sure that offensive opinions, which may change over time, right, are somehow get robust protection. But on the other hand, we should look at obscenity as a parallel. So there's a violation of a community standard there. And so obscenity has a carved out exception, right? So it's not that the First Amendment doesn't carve out exceptions. And these are complicated conversations. And the problem for me as a constitutional scholar, is these are the kinds of conversations we can have in the classroom, which is why I love talking to my students. But, it's so hard to have this conversation in public because people will just say, well, this is my First Amendment right, as if it's absolute, right? Without realizing, hold on, there are all these other limitations there. So can we talk about, right, what those limitations should look like in this context?
Well, I think a good example of that is Alex Jones. He has the freedom to say what he wants, but there are consequences for that.
Absolutely.
There's litigation from that. And he's recently learned that. So, that's important to note. We do live in a country where we are guaranteed the right to free speech, but that doesn't mean there can't be consequences for that.
Oh, no, there are absolute limits to that, right? And yes, and also you want to think about just creating an ethic around, what should be the proper speech, right? It doesn't always have to be a conversation about regulation. It can be a conversation about, why does this inflammatory speech, why does this kind of hateful speech, does it move the conversation forward in any way? And if it doesn't, then you have to sort of take a step back and say, what's the purpose of this, right? And I think building that ethic around it as well for us as community members, instead of just talking about what is or is not, can or cannot be regulated under the First Amendment, the other question is, what should we be saying to one another, right? When we're talking about Hitler, do we understand the absolute horrors and the tragedy, right? And the suffering that came from the Holocaust? So are we thinking about that, just and that's why, as you say, there are repercussions to that, because that comparison is problematic on so many levels. It has nothing to do with whether it's protected under the Constitution. It's self-problematic, in a social context.
Right. And not to stray too far, but, on a more positive note, in Connecticut, it wasn't mandatory to be taught about the Holocaust until I think about 2 or 3 years ago. That passed, it was optional. So I think the more that we learn about the context of Hitler and what happened, maybe people will think before they're going to invoke that or not.
Right. And that's what students have been asking, to say, look, there can my history be taught in the curriculum? I don't feel like I'm represented in some way. So you've had students say that, and you've had school boards respond, right? Because a number of students came out and said, I don't feel like I see my history represented in some way. Can we talk about how that's included, right? That's part of American history. But I don't see it in the textbook. So why isn't that in the textbook as well? And that's the conversation, I think, here. It's really a conversation about inclusion, right? Feeling that this story also has to be represented. It's part of history. Right? And we talk about all aspects of history, right? And this is part of American history. Can it be included in that conversation?
Sujata Gadkar Wilcox, you are very passionate, which I think is fantastic. And I'm hoping that your sense of optimism for your students pans out that way, because I think that we're all a little disturbed and a little scared about what we're hearing and seeing from people, not just on the news, but people in our communities. And I'm hoping we get back to a more civil place where we can have conversations with people and it doesn't have to erupt into anger, right?
Absolutely. I believe in communities, right? And our students are one kind of community. So I hope for that also.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on Real Talk. And we hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.